Welcome back, everybody. Last time we left off, we were reading some Hume, and we're going to continue reading some Hume. We were reading from Paul Russell's book, The Riddle of Hume's Treatise, and we were reading chapter 12, Matter, Omnipotence, and Our Idea of Necessity. Now, we got to section 3, and the first section that we were reading was primarily about occasionalism in Clarke, Baxter, Malebranche, and we also talked a little bit about Locke. So, let's read from here. Hume's discussion of the origin of our idea of necessity falls into the same pattern as many of his other discussions in the treatise. His search for the impression from which our idea of necessity is derived begins with a critique of several proposals that have been made by other philosophers, followed by his own alternative, constructive account of the nature and origin of this idea. The first suggestion he considers concerning the efficacy of causes comes from Locke's essay. Locke's suggestion, as Hume presents it, is that finding from experience that there are several new productions in matter, such as the motions and variations of body, and concluding that there must somewhere be a power capable of producing them, we arrive at last by this reasoning that the idea of power and efficacy. This account of the origin of our idea of necessity, Hume claims, is the most general and most popular explication of this matter. In reply to this, he argues that if we examine the case of one billiard ball colliding into another, moving it from its original position of rest, all we discover are the relations of contiguity, priority, and when the experiment is repeated, constant conjunction. Beyond this, however, we cannot discover any quality or principle in bodies in which force and agency is placed. This lack of success in discovering any force or power in the known qualities of matter has led philosophers to conclude that the ultimate force and efficacy of nature is perfectly unknown to us. Clearly then, however natural and popular the hypothesis that there exists some force or power in matter, this is not the origin or source of our idea of necessity. Given that we are unable to derive our idea of necessity from the known qualities of matter, philosophers have been driven to form an alternative hypothesis. Okay, so this is a really important part, and I said this in the last video. Hume here is looking for the impression of necessity. This is the whole paper. The whole paper is about the origin of our idea of necessity. And the first place that Hume looks, and we see this, there's 11 mentions in this article of this partial sentence, origin of our idea of necessity. And the first time it occurs is in this section that we're just reading now. And the second time, again, is in this section. And what Hume is doing is, as he is an empiricist, he's looking for from the copy principle, every single idea or impression that we have must be a copy of something external that comes from us. So where is this impression from necessity? We can explain causality with other descriptions of relations of contiguity, priority, and then constant conjunction. So if we can explain causality with these three elements, why do we need to postulate a fourth, which is necessary connection? It's unnecessary. And what Hume is looking at here is, given that we are unable to derive our idea, our impression of necessity from the known qualities of matter, philosophers have driven to form an alternative hypothesis. So the first hypothesis from Locke is that we can explain our idea of necessity from the known qualities of matter. Now we're going on to the second one. Hume describes the other hypothesis as the Cartesian view. Quote, matter, and this is from the treatise, or from don't know if it's actually from the treatise or from, yeah, it is from the treatise. So we've been driven to an alternative hypothesis to try and find and derive our ideas of necessity. Matter, say they, is in itself entirely inactive and deprived of any power by which it may produce or continue to communicate motion. But since these effects are evident of our senses, and since the power that produces them must be placed somewhere, it must lie in the deity, or that divine being who contains in all his nature excellency and perfection. 'Tis the deity, therefore, who is the prime mover of the universe, and who not only first created matter and gave it its original impulse, but likewise, by a continued exertion of omnipotence, supports its existence and successively bestows on it all those motions and configurations of qualities with which 'tis endowed. So described, this hypothesis is not obviously unique to the Cartesians, since, as noted, the same views were defined by Newtonians such as Clarke and Baxter. According to Hume, this opinion is certainly very curious and well worth our attention. He does not, however, waste many words in refuting it. Cartesians cannot be allowed to rely on the principles of innate ideas, if this is understood as the claim that we have an idea of the deity that is not derived from an antecedent impression. If every idea be derived from an impression, the idea of a deity proceeds from the same origin, and if no impression either of sensation or reflection implies any force or efficacy, 'tis equally impossible to discover or even imagine any such active principle in the deity. Since these philosophers, therefore, have concluded that matter cannot be endowed with any of the efficacious principle, because 'tis impossible to discover it in such a principle, the same course of reasoning should determine them to exclude it from the supreme being. Or, if they esteem that opinion absurd and impious, as it really is, I shall tell them how they may avoid it, and that is by concluding from the very first that they have no adequate idea of power or efficacy in any object, since neither in body nor in spirit nor in superior nor inferior natures are able to discover one single instance of it. So we have two quotes here, and so described, this hypothesis is not uniquely to Descartes or Cartesians, since, as noted, the same view is defended by Newtonians such as Clarke or Baxter. According to Hume, this opinion is certainly very curious and well worth our attention. He does not, however, waste any words refuting it. Cartesians cannot be allowed to rely on a principle of innate ideas if this is understood as a claim that we have any idea of the deity that is not derived from an antecedent impression. In this way, the conclusion that Hume reaches is that the hypothesis that all operations of matter are performed merely by the energy of the Supreme Being is no better founded than the suggestion that there is a power or force to be discovered in matter. We are therefore unable to discover any force or power in either of these ways. It would seem to follow, therefore, that since we have no impression of power efficacy, we have no idea of either. After the first two books of the treatise that were published in 1739, Hume returned to his work to consider a third possible source of necessity. This was Locke's suggestion that we derived the idea of active power from reflection on our own will. Hume first considered this plausibility briefly in the abstract, and then at more length in the appendix published in Book 3. In the abstract, Hume points out that, quote, our own minds afford us no more notion of energy than matter does. When we consider our will or volition a priori abstracting from experience, we are never able to infer any effect from it. And when we take the assistance of experience, it only shows its objects contiguous, successive, and constantly conjoined. This argument is somewhat expanded in the appendix to the treatise, where Hume argues again that the will being here considered a cause has no more a discoverable connection with its effects than any material cause has with its proper effects. By the time the first inquiry was published 8 years later, Locke's suggestion had come to preoccupy Hume. However, even up to the time of writing the appendix, Hume retained his original view. that the most natural and plausible place to look for the origin of our idea of necessity is in external objects or matter. Quote, no internal impression has any apparent energy more than external objects have. Since therefore matter is confessed by philosophers to operate by an unknown force, we should in vain hope to attain an idea of force by consulting our own minds. In the abstract, Hume points out that he confines most of his remarks to the relation of cause and effect, as discovered in the motions of and operations of matter. This reflects on emphasis as we find in Book 1, although he believes that the same reasoning extends to the operations of mind, and that the causal relations remain the same between both external and external objects. His attention is at this time firmly fixed on the case of the matter. Having considered and rejected each of these suggestions concerning the origin of our idea of necessity, it appears that Hume has arrived at a deeply skeptical conclusion about our idea of causation, namely that we have no such idea. So again, we're seeing in this paper with Russell, he's going through historically contextualizing Hume. And first we have Locke, that we see up here at the start of 3. Yeah, so he's dealt with Locke in this first paragraph. Then he goes on to deal with Descartes and the deity. And then he's going into another aspect of Locke. And Locke's suggestion that we derive the idea of active power from reflection on our own will. And then, having considered and rejected each of these 3 suggestions concerning the origin of our ideas of necessity, it appears that Hume has arrived at a deeply skeptical conclusion of our idea of causation. And then he has this quote here: thus, upon the whole, we may infer that we talk of any being, whether of a superior or inferior nature, as endowed with a power or force proportioned to any effect, when we speak of a necessary connection betwixt objects, and suppose that this connection depends upon an efficacy or energy with which any of these are endowed. In all these expressions so applied, we have really no distinct meaning, and make use only of common words without any clear and determinate ideas. Hume follows these remarks, however, with the suggestion that it is more probable that these expressions, power, force, do here lose their true meaning by being wrongly applied, than that they were never have any meaning. It is clearly his view, therefore, that these expressions do have some distinct meaning. This meaning can be discovered on his principles only by way of identifying some correct source of our idea of necessity. So Hume really is being like a detective here. He says we have this idea of necessity, of necessary connection, and it means something. I've looked, according to Locke and his idea of matter, I've looked at Descartes' idea of deity, I've looked at Locke's idea of reflection on our will, but I still can't find it. So where is it? And I know that it's meaningful in some sense. Hume has already made clear that our situation is like that of those who, being in search of anything that lies concealed from them, and not finding it in the places they expected, in the objects themselves, beat about all the neighbouring fields. What we are looking for is the new original idea, not to be found in any one instance, and which yet arises from the repetition of several instances. The repetition of similar objects in similar situations produces nothing new, either in these objects or in any external body. What we must do, therefore, is change the point of view from the objects to the perceptions. That is to say, it is in the mind of the observer, not in the objects themselves, that we can discover the origin of our idea of necessity of power. Now this, again, and Paul Russell is doing a phenomenal job here in peeling the onion. We start with Locke, we go to Descartes, we come back to Locke in their ideas of where we find the idea of the impression of necessary connection. And according to Hume, we don't find it in any of these places. And as a result, Hume is perplexed. And what he does is he changes the question. Hume has made it already clear that a situation is like that of those who, being in search of anything that lies concealed from them and not finding it in any place they expected, in the object themselves, beat about all the neighbouring fields. They are looking for a new original idea, not to be found. Just give me one moment here. Not to be found in any one instance, and which yet arises from the repetition of several instances. The repetition of similar objects in similar situations produces nothing either in the objects or any external body, but we still have it. We must do therefore is change the point of view from the objects to the perceptions. If I can't find it in external bodies, but it's still a repetition, is not to be found in the place that we expect, i.e. in the objects themselves. That is to say, it is in the mind of the observer. And here we see a pre-subjective turn, or in fact a subjective turn. And this is what German idealism is all about, dealing with the subjective turn with Kant. But I'm seeing here that we're seeing the subjective turn in Hume before we actually see it in Kant. Now, Hume doesn't follow that subjectivity through and do a critique of reason, but in the thorough sense that Kant does. But he at least opens this pathway that Kant is now, and Schelling and Fichte and Hegel and the rest of modernity is going to follow through into. So this is, you're seeing the flash for the first time in this very change the point of view from the objects to the perception. Like that is profound. Quote, for after we had observed the resemblance in a sufficient number of instances, we immediately feel a determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant and to conceive it in a stronger light upon account of that relation. This determination is the only effect of the resemblance, and therefore must be the same with the power of efficacy, whose ideas is derived from the resemblance. Necessity, then, is the effect of this observation, and is nothing but an internal impression of the mind, or the determination to carry out thoughts from one object to another. So that is a very good definition of what necessity turns out to be. Necessity, then, is the effect of this observation, and nothing but the internal impression of the mind, or determination to carry our thoughts from one object to another. According to Hume, this customary transition of the mind is the same with the power and necessity, which are consequently qualities of perceptions, not of objects, and are internally felt by the soul and not perceived externally in bodies. The conclusion Hume draws from all of this is that, upon the whole, necessity is something that exists in the mind and not in objects, nor is it possible for us to ever form the most distant idea of it, considered as in quantities of bodies. So if you take nothing from this paper, take from it the pathway that we have just been going on so far. So page 1, we end in page 157, and we start at section 3 on 154. That is basically step by step what Hume is looking for, and what necessity turns it out to be. We start with Locke and his idea of, we can find idea of necessity in material, or then we go to Descartes and we find it in deity, and we go back to Locke and look at it in the reflection of our will. It's not there. And we've looked in the external objects, it's not there, but it's still, we still experience necessity, we still demand necessity. And then Hume makes the turn. So let's read this quote. The efficacy or energy of cause is neither placed in the causes themselves, not in the deity, nor in the occurrence of these two principles, but belongs entirely to the soul, which considers the union of two or more objects in all past circumstances. 'Tis here the real power of causes is placed, along with their connection and necessity. And this is the source. That's it. The efficacy or energy of causes is neither placed in the causes themselves, not in the deity, not in the concurrence of two principles, but belongs entirely to the soul, which considers the union of two or more objects in all past circumstances. 'Tis here is the real power placed with the connection and necessity. Hume's final position is evidently not the skeptical claim that our idea of necessity is somehow meaningless or intelligible. On the contrary, we have an idea of necessity, and it is nothing but that determination of thought to pass from causes to effects, and from effects to causes, according to our experience union. So there is a reading out there that says, well, Hume has just completely got away from necessary connection and just throws causality to the wayside. But according to Paul Russell, well, hang on a second. He's not doing that. And that quote that we've just read has showed this. No, causality isn't in the external world. It's in us, in our soul. On the contrary, we have an idea of necessity, and it is nothing but that determination of the thought to pass from the causes to effects, and from effects to causes according to which they're experienced. Hume is aware that this conclusion, what we may refer to as his, quote, causal subjectivism, appears to me the most violent of all the paradoxes he advances in the treatise. In particular, any form of causal subjectivity of this kind seems to remove all causation from the objectives themselves, i.e. Hume denies a subjective account of causality and necessity. He puts the objection this way. What? The efficacy of causes lie in the determination of the mind, as if causes did not operate entirely independent of the mind and would not continue their operation, even though there was no mind existent to contemplate them or reason concerning them, though they may well depend on causes for its operation, but not causes of thought. Hume's answer to this objection is that he does allow the operations of nature are independent of our thought and reasoning. And according, he'd have observed that objects bear to each other the relations of contiguity and succession, that like objects may be observed in several instances to have like relations, and that all this is dependent of and antecedent to the operations of the understanding. But if we go any further and ascribe a power or necessary connection to these objects, this is what we can never observe in them, but must draw the idea of it from what we feel internally and contemplating them. In other words, Hume's reply to the objection proposed is that he does provide an account of objective causation, as it exists independent of our thought and reasoning. But this does not commit him to ascribe any unintelligible powers or necessity to the objects themselves. Hume is now in a position to use his distinction between objects, i.e. bodies, and perceptions as the basis of a precise definition of cause and effect. He offers two definitions of cause, the first of which is given in terms of the objects/bodies and the philosophical relations holding among them, and the second in terms of the ontology of perceptions and the natural relations that hold among them. If we define cause from the first perspective in terms of the operations of nature independent of our thought and reasoning, it is this: an object precedent and contiguous to another, and where all the objects resembling the former are placed in like relations of precedence and contiguity to those that resemble the latter. On the other hand, if we consider causation from the perspective of perceptions, it is defined in these terms: a cause is an object precedent and contiguous to another, and so united with it that the idea of the one determines the mind to form the idea of the other, and the impression of the one to form a more lively idea of the other. Further on in his discussion of liberty and necessity in Book 2, Hume provides two definitions of necessity that are, as with two definitions of cause, founded on the ontological distinction between objects, bodies, and perceptions. Quote, I define necessity in two ways. Comfortable to the two definitions of cause, of which it makes an essential part. I placed it either in the constant union and conjunction of like objects, in the inference of the mind from the one to the other. Throughout his discussion of liberty and necessity, Hume is especially concerned to show that when our ideas of causation and necessity are properly understood as defined, then it is evident that the moral realm, no less than the more physical realm of objects, is governed by causation and necessity. Whether we choose the words causation and necessity is entirely irrelevant, so long as the meaning contained in these ideas is properly understood. Hume is well aware that his account of causation and necessity encounters resistance in the form of a natural prejudice or bias against the analysis he has provided. However, the source of this, he argues, is easily identified. It is, he says, a common observation that the mind has a great propensity to spread itself on external objects and to conjoin with them any internal impression which they occasion and which always makes their appearance. At the same time, these objects discover themselves to the senses. Obvious examples of this, he suggests, are secondary qualities, such as sounds and smells, which we naturally but mistakenly attribute to objects themselves. The same propensity, Hume argues, is the reason why we suppose necessity and power to lie in the objects we considered, not in our mind that considers them. This natural tendency to project the connection we feel amongst perceptions in our mind back onto objects' bodies themselves can be accounted for by our related natural tendency to confound perceptions and objects. Clearly, then, we have a natural tendency to suppose that these connections that we feel in our minds have some objective correlate in the objects themselves, independent of our thought and reasoning about them. It is this natural bias or prejudice of the mind that is our greatest obstacle on Hume's analysis to identifying the true nature and origin of our idea of necessary connection. In this way, Hume provides a psychological explanation for the mistaken prejudice that leads us to continue to search for connection in matter, where it is impossible they can never exist. So we have this natural prejudice or bias against the analysis he has provided. The source of this, he argues, is easily identified. It is, he says, a common observation that the mind has a great propensity to spread itself on external objects and to conjoin with them any internal impression which they occasion, and which always make their appearance at the same time that these objects discover themselves to the senses. Okay. Does it follow from these claims that Hume dogmatically denies there are any unknown qualities or powers of matter? He makes clear that this is not what he is claiming. As he allows there are many, that there may be several qualities, both in material and immaterial objects, with which we are utterly unacquainted. It is his position, however, that even if we choose to call these unknown qualities by the words power, efficacy, all of this is of little consequence to the world. The important point is that these words so used have no real meaning or significance, and are of no relevance or interest either for Hume's philosophy or everyday practical life. Earlier in the treatise, he considered the objection that his philosophy explains only the manner in which objects affect the senses without endeavoring to account for their real nature and operations. He answers this objection as follows: by pleading guilty and by confessing that my intention was never to penetrate into the nature of bodies or explain the secret causes of their operations, for besides that this belongs not to my present purpose, I am afraid that such an enterprise is beyond the reach of human understanding, and we can never pretend to know body otherwise than those external properties, which discover themselves to the senses. According to Hume, the scope of his investigation, limited in this way, suffices for the conduct of life. And this also suffices for my philosophy, which pretends only to explain the nature and causes of our perceptions. Hume repeatedly emphasizes the point that all efforts to reach beyond these limits and hypothesize about the secret force and energy of causes as it exists in bodies are both futile and liable to obscure the true nature and origin of our ideas of causation and necessity. Several commentators have argued in recent years that, contrary to the traditional view that Hume holds, some form of regularity view of causation, he is in fact a causal realist. Now, this reminds me of this idea of regularity. So there's certain criteria that in this, if I just go back up to page 158, we have precedence and contiguity, resemblance, and relation of precedence and contiguity. Okay, because we have contiguity, priority, and then constant conjunction. Okay. So, page 13. Does it follow from these claims that Hume dogmatically denies there are unknown qualities? In power and matter? He makes it clear this is not what he is claiming, as he allows that there may be several qualities, both in material and immaterial objects, with which we are utterly unacquainted. In his position, however, that even if we choose to call these unknown qualities by the words power or efficacy, all this of little consequence to the world, the important point is that these words so used have no real meaning or significance, and are of no relevance or interest either for Hume's philosophy or our everyday practical life. Earlier in the treatise, he considered the objection that his philosophy explains only the manner in which objects affect the senses without endeavoring to account for the real nature and operation. He answers his objection as follows. By pleading guilty and by confessing that my intention never was to penetrate into the nature of bodies or explain the secret causes of their operation, for besides that this belongs not to my present purposes, I am afraid that such an enterprise is beyond the reach of human understanding, and that we can never pretend to know body otherwise than those external properties which discover themselves to the senses. According to Hume, the scope of his investigation, limited in this way, suffices for the conduct of life, and this also suffices for my philosophy, which pretends only to explain the nature of causes in our perception. Hume repeatedly emphasizes the point that all efforts to reach beyond these limits and hypothesize about the secret force or energy of causes as exists in bodies are both futile and liable to obscure the true nature and origin of idea of causation and necessity. So, okay, so where are we now? Now we're in a different debate. We're in the actual new debate that is going on around about Hume. And this is where we are. Okay. Several commentators have argued in recent years that, contrary to the traditional view that Hume holds some form of regularity view of causation, he is in fact a causal realist who did not question the existence of real forces in nature any more than he questioned the existence of independent external bodies themselves. Perhaps the clearest and most succinct account of the causal realist interpretation is provided by Strawson in his article David Hume, Objects and Powers. According to Strawson, the traditional regularity interpretation presents Hume as making a positive ontological assertion about the ultimate nature of reality, which is violently at odds with Hume's epistemological skepticism. Strawson maintains that although Hume does not make positive claims about what definitely or knowably does not exist, He also never really questions the idea that there is causation, i.e. causal powers in the object, something in virtue of which regularity is regular in the way that it is. On Strawson's account, therefore, Hume holds that real powers in objects exist, i.e. causation, even though we have no positive contentful conception of it. The account of Hume's comments I have defended in this chapter rejects the causal realist interpretation. It goes astray on a number of points. The most important may be summarized as follows. As noted, it is no part of the interpretation I have provided to argue that Hume dogmatically denies the existence of unknown secret powers in bodies or external objects. On the contrary, he explicitly allows that powers of this kind may exist, but also maintains that this is of little consequence to the world, since we know nothing of them. On the other hand, contrary to the causal realist account, Hume is no less concerned to argue that we do have a proper and full idea of causation and necessity, not a mere relative idea. This idea of causation and necessity is provided in the form of his two definitions. The significance of his explanation of our natural bias to prejudice against these definitions is to expose the psychological mistake we make when we suppose that we have some further idea of causation as it exists in the object body themselves. The root of this mistake is our natural tendency to confuse perceptions on objects and transfer those connections that we feel among our constantly conjoined perceptions back to the objects themselves. So now we're in the new debate of Hume, and we have left actually what is going on. Well, we're going on to the scholarly debate now, and it's important that we know Russell is rejecting the causal realist interpretation. So, where are we so far? Well, we started with 3. If I can get that page. 5, 7, I don't want to go too far yet. So in this paragraph here, on page 8 of the PDF and page 154 in the book, he's first considering the efficacy of causes comes from Locke essay. Power capable of producing them, we arrive by this reasoning at the idea of power and efficacy. And then Hume goes on to give the billiard ball example against this. And given that we are unable to derive our idea of necessity from known qualities of matter, philosophers have been driven to form an alternative hypothesis. So let's focus in on this section again. Hume's discussion of the origin of our idea of necessity falls into the same pattern as many of his other discussions in the treatise. His search for the impression, I presume Russell is talking about the religious sense in Hume's writings. His search for the impression from which our idea of necessity is derived begins with his critique of several proposals that has been made by other philosophers, followed by his own alternative constructive account of the nature of our idea, of origin of this idea. The first suggestion he considers, the efficacy of causes, comes from Locke's essay. Locke's suggestion, as Hume presents it, is that, quote, finding from experience that there are several new productions in matter, such as the motion and variation of body, and concluding that there must somewhere be a power capable of producing them, we arrive at last, by this reasoning, at the idea of power and efficacy. This account of the origin of our idea of necessity, Hume claims, is the most general and popular explication of this matter. In reply to this, he argues that if we examine the case of one billiard ball colliding into another, moving it from its original position of rest, we discover are the relations of contiguity, priority, and then constant conjunction. I mean, there is a regularity that we see in constant conjunction. And there's a resemblance. Beyond this, however, we cannot discover any quality or principle in bodies in which force or agency is placed. This lack of success in discovering any force or power in the known qualities of matter has led philosophers to conclude that the ultimate force and efficacy of nature is perfectly unknown to us. Clearly then, however natural and popular this hypothesis that there exists some force or natural power in matter, this is not the origin or source of our idea of necessity. So this is something that we're going to look into more. Because to me, it feels like Russell is going a little bit fast over this. I need to know more. I mean, why does the billiard ball? I mean, we do see contiguity because it's hitting all the time. We do see priority one is happening in front of the other. And we do see a constant conjunction. I would love to know more about, then he just seems to go from that to the conclusion. But why? Beyond this, however, we cannot discover any quality. Why? Is it because I want to hear from Russell, how does the billiard ball example, step by step, in more detail, lead us to the idea of that there is no necessary connection? Okay, we'll leave that there. We will definitely come back to this. I'm going to read another paper, but we'll definitely come back to this. Okay, see you next time.